Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in. Hello, sir.
Hey, I was just starting to wonder if I'd gotten it wrong and we weren't recording today.
No. We're good to go. How are you doing?
Let's do it.
Did you have a good Thanksgiving?
Yeah, so lots of Friendsgivings, just, several parties and ate too much. How about you?
Great. I was on this 7-day meditation retreat, so I was totally off the grid. I'm seeing my family actually next week, and yeah, it was restorative and excited to be back. I I was like, hopefully World War III doesn't happen or something, because I missed Twitter, but it seemed like not much in the world happened. Is that possible?
I don't know. There was some woman who had sort of a silly PhD thesis that people were like yelling about. South Korea appears to have had some sort of coup. That was today. Let's think of what else happened. Oh, some Syrian rebels took over some pieces of Syria, backed by Turkey. And now that Hezbollah has been sort of screwed and Iran's been sort of bombed, and then Russia's withdrawn its forces to Ukraine, there's not a lot backing up the Syrian government. So then all sort of that was the alliance that sort of crushed the Syrian rebels back in the day. Now that alliance is gone, and Turkey is sort of refloating the Syrian rebellion. They're pretty Islamist guys. They're not ISIS, but they're pretty. They're like a little Taliban-esque. Those are the guys who are fighting Assad. So it's just it's bad versus bad. What else is going on in America? It's not clear. They are Trump nominated Kash Patel to be head of the FBI. Kash Patel is like Trump's most loyal warrior. He released some children's book about how with Trump as the king and how they tried to take down the king, and he's just like the most slavish Trump loyalist that you'll ever find. He is nominated to head the FBI. He also has like this 1,000-yard stare. It's honestly a little scary. And then let's see what else happened. Anything interesting? No. I wrote probably my most popular post ever.
Was it the indigenous people?
It was indeed.
Oh, I want to get into it, but first, what was the PhD thesis about? Was this about I saw this going viral. What was it? The one that people think is really stupid?
It's basically saying that people are that describing people as stinky allows you to exclude them.
Oh.
And that's the thesis.
And why did it go so? Why is it so controversial, or why is it so viral? Because it's just like stupidity.
Who knows? I mean, I think there's a number of reasons. I never know why these because there's equally dumb PhD theses just like aplenty every day. We mint way too many PhDs in this country, and STEM too. In econ too. Like we just hand out way too many PhDs like candy, and then people are like, "Oh, I'm going to have an academic career." No, you're not. And so we get this massive elite overproduction of people with PhDs, and then I think that's the real story here. But why did this one go particularly viral? Well, I think it's sort of like the politicization of the academy, of like people, conservatives think, oh, this is how leftist bullshit has basically taken over research in the humanities, and they're right. They're completely right about that. Humanities and the soft social sciences. The leftist bullshit has basically replaced any other sort of reason for existence that those people. I remember sitting around in a cafe in Ann Arbor with some humanities PhD students in 2011, and I said, I was just trolling them. I was like, okay, so what's the purpose of your field? And they said to help marginalized groups. Well, that was 2011. That was before the woke era. So basically, these fields have been adrift for a long time. No one knows why they're supposed to publish, do all this research, and so they came up with like helping marginalized groups as sort of this. It filled the gap in like their reason for doing research, and the real fundamental problem is that we've applied this sort of industrial lab research model with publish or perish and all that stuff. We applied that to the humanities and social sciences where it doesn't really fit. And we just force people to publish. And so they have to think of like something to publish on. And here comes progressive politics with saying like, oh, help marginalized groups. And so then that becomes a thing you could do.
Yeah. Well, your Thanksgiving post, I'm sure angered a bunch of those people. So let's get into that. I actually think it's a really interesting topic that hasn't really been talked about as much, and so I'm not surprised that it's your most popular post. Let's get into the argument the case that you made, and then I have a few sort of follow-up questions around it.
The response to this post has been overwhelmingly positive. Like almost nobody got mad. that I saw. There were like a couple people, like one or two nobodies who got mad. Like there were no giant denunciations. It does not seem to have made people very mad.
It's basically something that everyone believed or knew was true, but maybe was too shy to say it, a couple years ago or something.
I should just figure out like what are people. Well, I never want to pander to the world, but then sometimes things need to be said, And so I've got to figure out what do I believe that I just took for granted and never said because I never got around to saying it because I thought everyone just believes this anyway. But that other people are afraid to say, because part of the thing is that I'm actually not afraid to say anything. I'm a little wary about about things that I don't have an area of expertise in. That's different than being like afraid to say something because I'll anger public opinion. There's nothing that public opinion can do to me that's negative, right? Like I have no attack surface. Like they can't make me lose my job.
Yeah, you write a Substack. You're not going to get fired by this is sort of the new economy. But okay, so basically what you were saying is that no one has a right to land who doesn't own the land, basically.
Well, yeah. Well, not quite that. I said, institutions own land. So the United States as an organization owns land, right? That's who actually owns land. The idea that you are on indigenous land, say all the land declarations and whatever, is promulgating an alternative theory of land ownership. That land ownership is owned by races, by ethnic groups, and it's owned ancestrally. So if my ethnic blood ancestors, or the people who are notionally the same racial group as me, the Poles, the Franks, the Bumiputera, the Cherokee, the Ramaytush Ohlone, whoever, whatever racial people was notionally assumed to be on this land far long ago, or first, even though it wasn't, of course, wasn't really first, but the idea that those people are those are the racial owners, and if you're part of that racial group, you have a right to this land. This is your blood, inheritance of this land. And I think this is just a terrible way to allocate land. And by and large, the world has moved away from this. We don't really do this anymore. Some nations are like officially, very few nations do this. I think you could argue that Israel sort of does it, Malaysia does it, and then you have a couple others. But then, and of course, de facto, a number of other nations are doing it. Like Russia, de facto is the land of the Ruski people, who are like 80% of the Russian nation, right? They are the ethnic group that just dominates everything and views themselves as sort of the sons of the soil, the rightful owners of this land. But they don't say it officially. Officially, they're a multiracial nation and blah blah blah. So officially, de jure, let's say, most nations have moved away from being ethnostates, and yet when the people come out and do the land declarations on Thanksgiving or whenever and say you are on indigenous land, which is like become this incantation that progressives intone in everywhere they go, and that often elected democratic officials even say before meetings and stuff. They are endorsing racial nationalism. They are endorsing ethno-nationalism. The idea that a tribe of people through dint of blood, through dint of race, has a right to this plot of Earth's territory in perpetuity. And I think that's wrong. That's bullshit. If you stop to think about where that leads, it leads to a very dark world. I think most people sort of agree in the abstract that ethno-nationalism of that sort is bad. And yet what they haven't done is allow themselves to realize that land declarations are ethno-nationalist.
And so that makes it, a lot of people will agree with that in the abstract, but I think where it gets really interesting is in specific cases, because something like Israel, does Israel have a justification for doing what it's doing or for being ethno-nationalist? And if other people look at Israel and say, hey, if Israel gets to be that, why can't we also set up a place for our religious group or our race and prioritize people,
I mean, it's a fair question, but I think on the other hand, a lot of people around the globe were very uncomfortable with Israel, and not just because like they're Muslim and they hate Jews or whatever. It's not just anti-Semitism; it's the idea of an ethno-state that gets land because you think this is your ancestral land is bad. Like a lot of people think that's bad, but yet that was really the idea behind the original Zionist project. Have you ever seen the old movie Exodus? It's like this rah-rah movie about like the foundation of Israel, and it has this song from Exodus that we played in my orchestra when I was in high school, and I noticed that the lyrics were, "This land is mine. God gave this land to me. This brave and ancient land to me." And that's the dun 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 dun. Anyway, I'm not going to sing theme songs on. Maybe we can have that be a regular thing, karaoke with Noah. But no, so that's the song. But the Bible never said that God gave that land to that individual. when they say to me, that means to my race, to my group, or to my religion. Like it could be religious too. Religious nationalism is another thing, and then you get into the question of, is religion defined racially? Blah blah blah. Like, are Ethiopian Jews really full and equal Jews in Israel? Blah blah. And so you get into these complicated issues, but if people can never quite decide if Judaism is a religion or a race, they probably should decide that. And I think it should be a religion, not a race. But some people do think of it as a race, and so I think that sits uneasily with a lot of people, right? And yet at the same time, during decolonization, that was not an unpopular idea. The idea that ethnostates, that states shouldn't be ethnostates, is relatively recent. It's since World War II, the advanced countries have moved toward that faster than other countries. But I think, there was a lot of idea, when countries were kicking the British out or kicking the French out or whatever, after World War II, there was a lot of thought of like, this is the land of our racial people. And then just exactly who that racial people was became a giant point of contention, and you saw a massive outbreak of genocides around the world in civil wars. We called them civil wars. They were racial struggles over who gets to be like the people of the land, ethno-state struggles. And so the Rwandan genocide, the Hutus versus Tutsis, these two sort of ethnicities that are rather recent in their definition, actually. So the idea of Hutu and Tutsi was sort of reified by the French. Those were sort of more minor tribes before, and the French just sort of classified, okay, you're the Hutus, you're the Tutsis. But anyway, this idea of who are the sons of the soil, who are the people of the land, or the Khmer Rouge, people underrate the degree to which that was an anti-Chinese racial genocide. Whereas, like, we are the Khmer people, you are these interloper ethnic Chinese people.
So is your idea that Jews, or the idea behind why Jews you think should choose to be more of a religion than a race, because that's more inclusive? People can convert, or why do you think that?
Well, I think that's one reason, yeah. But like, if you already look at who are Jews, you see that a very large number of Israeli Jews are Mizrahi. They're, ethnically they're Arabs. You have some Ethiopian Jews. You have Sephardic Jews who are themselves sort of an ethnic mishmash. You have Ashkenazic Jews, the most famous guy, like you and me, right? The big nose Jews, you and me and Scarlett Johansson. We're we got our characteristic large noses and large eyes, and we are just one ethnic group that happened. Ashkenazic means German in some other language, and because those were Jews who came from Germany, we're of partial like Italian descent. I think we're genetically pretty close to Italians, but yeah. So like, that's an ethnic group, but no one says that Israel is the land of the Ashkenaz, right? That's not a thing. Like Mizrahi Jews actually, I think, outnumber Ashkenazi Jews by quite a bit in Israel. And a lot of those Mizrahi Jews were religiously persecuted. They escaped from places like Iraq, where they were ethnically exactly the same as their neighbors. They just had a different religion, so they're religiously persecuted. So I think that the reality of what Judaism means is that it's a religion. And Europeans are used to thinking of Judaism as a race because they're used to dealing with Ashkenazic Jews and equating those with Jews. And so in the US and the West, our idea of Jews is still heavily influenced by this old European idea of Jews as Ashkenazi Jews, and those are the same thing. There were always Sephardic Jews. There were always like the Dutch and British Jews and Spanish Jews, but like mostly Ashkenazic. Almost entirely the European Jews were Ashkenazic, and so Europeans got used to equating that ethnic group with Judaism as a religion. But in Israel, this is definitely not true, because the Mizrahis like outnumber the Ashkenazic Jews. And I think that our discourse, so you see a lot of Western leftists saying that Israelis should go back to Poland or whatever, right? I'm not sure how Poland feels about that. But the idea that Ashkenazic Jews are actually indigenous to Europe. They're white people, they're indigenous Europeans, and they're colonizers, whatever. But this ignores the Mizrahi Jews, who are, ethnically similar to these other people. That's a sidetrack. I think my main point is that this whole idea of allocating land to races of people is dumb. Like, this is bad. Land belongs to institutions. The United States of America is an institution, right? There's no race of Americans, including the people we call Native Americans. Like, those people are not a race that has perpetual right to all of this land, but nor are the descendants of British colonists. Those people are not sons of the soil who have an ancestral racial right to all of this land. The United States as an institution, as a thing, as a country, is what owns this land. and can do with it as it sees fit. And you can say, well, this isn't fair because the United States conquered that land and it was bloody and horrible. There were genocides and ethnic cleansing and stolen land and blah blah. Well, that's true. That did happen. That's also how every other nation began in the world. Basically, if you go back far enough, I mean, Ireland, like I think the Irish ethnos was like the first people in Ireland. No, like there's nowhere in the world. There were waves of migration. Started off with like a few hunter-gatherer bands, and then more and more and more, and then some farmers came, and then blah blah blah, and these things happen slowly. There's no like band of co-racialists who walk up to this virgin piece of land and say, I am the very first person to discover this land. This will belong to my descendants in perpetuity. Like that didn't happen. And even if it did happen, it would be stupid because like, why should that be true? What about the people who were a little slower and weren't the first to lay eyes on a piece of land? Why does laying eyes on a piece of land give you and your race group ownership of it in perpetuity? That's moronic.
Right. And so just to go back to Israel for a second, so Israel is an institution that has decided that it's for the Jews, or it's like, primarily in service of Jewish people, and that makes people uncomfortable, or certain people, sort of our sort of classical liberal mindset or sort of ethos uncomfortable because it sort of, conjures sort of implications of an ethno-state, and we associate ethno-states with sort of in-groups, out-groups, and, sort of racial violence towards the outgroups. Is that sort of a fair summary?
Yeah, exactly. If you and you can really see this in terms of Israel, setting aside the whole Gaza war, whatever, you see in the West Bank, Israel has supported settlers who have grabbed more and more pieces of land for themselves, Jewish settlers, and from the Palestinian people who lived there have been slowly forced off, and then the Israeli army occupying the West Bank has basically supported this. They'll maintain checkpoints and they'll restrict freedom of movement for the people there. And then there's large blocks of settlements being built up around Jerusalem and those areas and some other areas, and it's like a slow settler colonization. That's the word that leftists use, but it's a correct term. And so everybody focuses on Gaza, but Gaza is more like an actual war. Gaza is more like it was basically an independent nation state that was just undeclared. But Israel's army was not there, and Hamas was the government of that nation state, and they attacked Israel, and Israel attacked them back. That's sort of the typical like you attack me, I attack you kind of war that happens. But in the West Bank, you see that is really much better described by the stuff that the leftists talk about with like settler colonialism and whatever, with all this slow land grabs and the Israeli army basically adjudicating things by, I wouldn't call it race, I would call it religion. I think Israel's better understood. A lot of people call Israel an ethno-state, but I think it's actually a theocracy. Although they're not, in fact, they do have religious bodies determine who can immigrate, who gets free Israeli citizenship because who counts as a religious Jew. Like, that's a theocracy. They have rules about intermarriage, like which faith can marry which faith. Like, I think Israel is more similar to Saudi Arabia or Iran. I mean, they're less brutal in some ways than, well, at least depending on who you're talking about. But I think Israel is more similar to Saudi Arabia and Iran than to Nazi Germany or the old ethnos or any of the old ethno-states, Kingdom of the Franks. I don't think that's what they really are. So I think that Israel is a Middle Eastern country where religion sort of dominates race, and I think we ought to think, and Western people where race dominates religion in the West, we have a hard time thinking about that fact. And of course, Israel would insist that it's neither of those. But I think very few people talk about Israel in terms of being a theocracy, but I think that that's more descriptive than ethno-state.
And do you think theocracies have basically the same problems as ethno-states, or do you think they are somehow better?
Very related, yeah. Well, so it's partially related because theocracy is very different because you can convert, right? So if you go and you are like a convert to Islam, you can live in Saudi Arabia, and be like full and equal Saudi Arabian, right? Even if you're white. In fact, some people do. Like Chechens are white. They go to Saudi Arabia, they convert, whatever. I have a few of them. But then, theocracy you can convert, and then so theocracy, it's your mimetic descendants who rule a place instead of your genetic descendants, right? It's not like I can trace my descent to these people. It's like I adhere to this. A religion is an institution in some way. It's not an institution like a nation state. It's a third thing. It's like it's not an ethnos. It's not a race, but it's also not a nation state. It's a third thing. It's a secret third thing. Yeah. So it's just another way of organizing a nation, right? And I think that it has major problems. I don't like theocracy, but I also think it's not quite the same as ethnostates. And then with theocracy, how do you get rid of minority religions? Well, medieval Spain shows us how you do that. So you can genocide people, but more often you forcibly convert them. So the way Spain got rid of Sephardic Judaism was primarily not by concentration camps, death camps, or like mass slaughter. They did kill some people, but like mostly they just said, you have to convert now, or we're going to torture you. We'll burn your house. We'll take your stuff. We might kill you. They killed a few people. But they basically, they were like, you have to convert. And so all the Jews were like, okay, we convert. I'm Christian now, And in fact, if you go to Latin America, there's still a lot of old Jewish traditions celebrated in Latin America that people pretend are Catholic traditions because they converted and they kept their family traditions from the Spanish Inquisition. And so that was, then some Jews were kicked out. They were kicked to North Africa. The Muslims were more tolerant at that time. And that's how you do it in theocracy. That's bad. I don't like the Spanish Inquisition, but it's different. It's different than how you do genocide. Like when you just slaughter people. Of course, you see religious genocides too, right? You see people killed on the basis of mass slaughter on the basis of religion. Sometimes, I would say, but more often you'll see like mass forced conversions. So it's bad. It's bad in a different way. Like I don't like either of those things. I want nations to be institutional, like civic nations, where basically citizenship and adherence to the state, the nation state, and its founding ideals and its current institutions, that determines your presence, your rightful presence in the nation state. That's what I want, and that's what most countries at least call themselves now.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
There are over 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the United States and millions more around the world. How do you know which ones can make the biggest impact with your donation? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They pore over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-backed organizations that are saving and improving lives. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Erik Torenberg at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Econ 102 to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 40,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to your immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/102. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/102. That's netsuite.com/102.
Well, it's interesting. So, first, let me put aside explain my priors, which is I'm definitely spiritually aligned with you on this. I think the reason why America, or one of the reasons why America is the greatest country in the world, is because we can take, we're a nation of immigrants, and we could take or sort of inspire people from all over the world, the best people from all over the world, to come to this country and do incredible things, and we can assimilate them. And we don't have this sort of in-group out-group that is this sort of Native American population, and and we don't exclude the brilliant people from all over the world. We're the best at attracting and assimilating immigrants. So I think that is our superpower. And so I'm glad we're not like an ethno-state. Okay, now let me play devil's advocate a bit, which is like, Mark Andreessen likes to recommend this book, The Ancient City, which basically talks about how, isn't it true that something like, most sort of, countries or states in history were ethno-states, right? Like America is the exception, right? It's like maybe it's one of the only countries ever that has been able to, assimilate immigrants to the degree that it has, and has this success. Like most empires, right? Where ethno, and China, Japan, these are not ethno-states as far as I understand them, but there is like, I guess the devil's advocate view would be like, hey, isn't it true that countries that have a lot of homogeneity have a lot of social cohesion and have some benefits too? And so could you imagine a world where some countries are immigration beacons? And I was actually thinking about this, like, if America wins not just because it attracts immigrants, but it attracts the best immigrants. Like, if you're a country that can't attract top immigrants, you might be adversely selecting into like refugees or something. And so immigration might not, it's, might not be in your advantage if you can't attract the best people. So you could have some countries that are attracting all the best people from all over the world, but then basically a ton of other like Israels for, I don't know, people who kind of want that. Anyways,
So I think that's reasonable. My biggest experience in this regard is Japan. So Japan, has like cultural homogeneity in Japan is what makes Japan run. When people don't follow Japan has a culture with lots of rules. And if people don't follow the rules, Japan sort of starts breaking down. And all the things we like about Japan go away. America is a land without many rules, but Japan is a land of many rules. And however, so Japan has never officially defined itself as an ethno-state, except in World War II during the fascist time. That was the only time when they actually said, like, we are the nation of the Yamato people. So the actual name for the Japanese ethnicity is Yamato, which is that is what Japanese people will use. Like, if they use the word Nihonjin, that will mean like a citizen of Japan. And then if you go around asking people, like an ethnic Russian who is raised in Japan, speaks only Japanese, like whatever, and is a citizen, obviously, is that person Japanese? And a majority of Japanese people that I asked, I went around asking this to bartenders and like randos. So I think I got a decent sample. That was over 10 years ago that I did that. And they said, because I was just curious to see how Japanese people sort of define their own nationhood, more than half said, yes, that's a Japanese person. And in fact, on the Sea of Japan coast, Russian sailors would come and settle there. Like, there are people who just look white in Japan. And like, oh, you look different. You must be from this area. In fact, the Japanese race, if you talk to Razib Khan, who sort of like does the math on all these things, and the Japanese race, quote unquote, is an amalgamation of 4 different racial groups. Effectively, Mongols, Koreans, sort of Siberians, and Filipinos. Those 4 groups, or something like those, I'm approximating, right? These all have names. But then those 4 groups made up Japan. And essentially, Mongols and Koreans are like the 2 biggest groups. And so you see this right now. In Japan, you have the words soy face and sauce face. Sauce meaning barbecue sauce. I don't know why those are called, but so soy face means something different than it does in America. In America, soy face is a reference to a web cartoon. You're like, because I don't remember why that's true, but that's what we mean when we say soy face. But in Japan, soy face means you look Korean. You have a broad, flat face with a big square forehead, and like that's and a flat nose. Like that's a soy face. And then sauce face is you have like a almost like a hook nose, like a beaked sort of nose, and like more prominent cheekbones, sort of a more angular face. And so like you've seen Shogun, right? The show Shogun.
No, I haven't seen you.
Okay, so Asano Tadanobu, my favorite Japanese actor, has a sauce face. Oh, he is a quarter Russian, but he also has a sauce face. And so you can see what these look like, but those are from the Mongol and Korean ancestries. Just occasionally recombining to produce a face that looked especially Korean or especially Mongol. The Japanese race is synthetic. It is made up, right? The Yamato people is a made up concept, right? Race is a social construct. That's what we mean. Japanese people didn't have to call themselves one race. They could have called themselves multiple races and just called most of those people like mixed. They could have said we're mestizo, we're half, there's like, Mexican people don't really think of mestizo as a race. They just say I'm mixed. It's a descriptive term, right? That could, like, it's a descriptive term meant to sort of unify the descendants of Spanish and like Aztec and Mayan people, right? And in the same way, so Japan chose to think, oh, this is a race, but Japan has never really defined itself by that race. During the fascist time they did, but it was sort of a little bit grafted on from like imitating Germany. Honestly, a lot of their stuff was just like imitation of Nazi Germany at the time, because like that was their main ally. So they're like, oh, you're cool, we'll imitate you. But if you talk to Japanese people, they'll say we're a culture. Japan is a culture, cultural civilization. They'll say, not a race. The idea that Japan is this racial nation state is grafted on by Westerners. Homogeneity is incredibly important in Japan, but it's cultural homogeneity. Racial homogeneity is, of course, important to some people in Japan because, they look at you and they say, oh, you look Japanese, right? But then the people who are most harshly excluded from that are Koreans, especially Koreans. Like, Koreans are the people who are most harshly and strongly excluded from the Japanese, like, populace, right? There was a history of Zainichi Koreans, who were people who, Japan doesn't have birthright citizenship, so you had descendants of Korean immigrants who would retain Korean citizenship throughout the generations, even though they only spoke Japanese and had Japanese sounding names. And so, like, you had those people, and so but they were considered other. They're resident foreigners, even if they speak nothing but Japanese and have just grown up there their entire life. So the way people define these things is very different. Japan has experimented with the idea that with some ethno-state-like things. So when Japan started to realize they needed immigrants, they started bringing in ethnic Japanese Brazilians. So you hear that Japan brought in all these Brazilians. Well, those were all ethnic Japanese Brazilians. They looked Japanese, in the racial sense. They looked Japanese in the racial sense, and they settled in Japan, and they immediately massive problems started happening because people started getting knifed. Like, the Japanese Brazilians were like, stereotype. I'm using stereotype here, crazy, and like would just knife you. And their culture was not compatible with Japanese culture. It was Brazilian culture, and it was very working class, lower class Brazilian culture. So that's what I mean. And so they were culturally incompatible, and Japan sent most of them back. They realized that just having a face that you think looks sort of Japanese doesn't mean you fit in Japan. They broke the homogeneity of Japan, even though they didn't break the racial, visual, face-wise homogeneity of Japan at all. They looked Japanese, and that's why they were brought there. But they didn't work. Culturally, they were not Japanese. And so now I think the people in charge of Japan are slowly starting to realize that some people, weebs basically, who assimilate very strongly to Japan, even if they don't look racially Japanese, actually fit in much, much better than the racially looking Brazilians. So Japanese people are slowly groping their way towards the fact that it's cultural homogeneity that matters in Japan, not, appearance-wise racial homogeneity. But that realization still hasn't been reflected in official policies because Japan doesn't have active assimilation policies. And so the Japanese government is moving very slowly on this and hasn't really thought clearly about what they want from immigration. They just know they need it economically because of their population, so they've chosen to open their country up to immigration over the last 10, 12 years. But they still haven't implemented active assimilation policies that will preserve the cultural homogeneity of Japan. Well, let me tell you a story real quick, at the risk of rattling on too long. There's a woman in your graduating class, I believe, named Alexa, who is really into Japanese stuff. She's from the suburbs of Detroit, and she always just really wanted to be Japanese. She's an extreme weeb, took Japanese courses and became extremely fluent, married a Japanese guy, moved to Japan. I would occasionally meet up with her in Japan. I have never met someone who's more stereotypically Japanese than Alexa, just this white girl from suburban Michigan. And there were a number of people like that in the Japan club, mostly white girls from suburban Michigan who ended up marrying Japanese men in the Japan club at University of Michigan. And, especially Alexa, I didn't know the others as well. She was a friend of mine, but then she assimilated to an astonishing degree. Like, she out-Japaneses almost every Japanese person I've ever met. And I think eventually Japan's going to realize that people like that are the future of immigration. People who want to, and that people like the Japanese Brazilians will not assimilate as well, will not preserve homogeneity, as well as people who just act really Japanese and obey all the rules. What do you think of that?
I think it's really interesting. Okay, let me bring up this idea, and I think it'll circulate back to this idea. So there's this term that I saw that is said in some right-wing circles by this Twitter account called Kovefe Anon. He's kind of like this random right-wing Twitter person, Anon. And his term, the term is, the woke are more correct than the mainstream. And I think when he says mainstream, he means like classical liberal. And basically he does this thing where he takes a phrase that the woke will say, and I'll give you one example. Woke will say something like, old boys club, like, businesses hire people who look like them, and there's cognitive bias, right? And a classical liberal might say, yeah, well, maybe it's not a perfect example. I guess when a classical might say, yes, that might happen, but we should treat everybody fairly or something. But what he will say is the way that the woke are more correct is that they tap into something that is actually like a deeper truth, even if they come about it in the wrong way. So the example there would be like, yeah, people do hire people that look like them, but the way that the woke are wrong is that he would say, the right wing version of it is like, maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's like people who tend to look like each other or have some shared context in this way, it's maybe easier to build kinship and thus work better together. Another example might be this one is, so yeah, I guess I forgot it. I'll come back to it. But I guess it's like, one, I think this idea that the woke are more correct okay, here's the controversial one. Basically, remember there was this.
It's good to focus on race, but we should accept it instead of, we should just like accept that racial homogeneity is important, and that like accept the woke focus on race and just do it in a right-wing way. That's the idea.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Our sponsor for today's episode is Carta, the end-to-end accounting platform that's purpose-built to power the strategic impact of the fund CFO. For the first time ever, private fund operators can now leverage their very own bespoke software that's designed from the ground up to bring their whole portfolio together, enabling formations, transactions, and distributions to flow seamlessly and accurately. The end result? A remarkably fast and precise platform that empowers better strategic decision-making and delivers transformational insights on demand, timely K1s, holistic fund performance data, and so much more. Come see the new standard in private fund management at carta.com/investors. That's carta.com/investors.
In that specific example, but there are lots of other examples that are not related to race that woke people still say. They just get at, classical liberal wants to have this sort of blank slate a little bit, and it's sort of blank slateist view on a bunch of different things. And the woke will have this emphasis, whether it's on gender or race or other things. They'll sort of identify some sort of deeper sort of, I don't know, truth or like way of looking at something. And the classical liberal view will want to deny it because it sort of is because it will break the classical liberal view, which is that like, people are fundamentally equal, or certainly groups of people are fundamentally equal. And so yeah, that's the idea. And so the sort of, I don't know where that brings us back to the Japan example. Maybe that's like what you described. Maybe that's like,
maybe like, Korea would be a better example, or maybe, I don't know, Sweden, something like that. Like yeah, like maybe Japan is just a weird country. Japan is a weird country in many ways. And maybe it's a bad example. So like Korea for the Koreans is actually maybe, a better example.
Let me give you a couple other questions that relate to this. There's a local example, then there's a national example. A local example might be something like, gentrification. So this would be an anti-gentrification argument too, right? Like, because like cities are institutions, and the city should just do what's best for the institution, right? And so if a bunch of other people are going to come into the city and make it more valuable, that might lead to, people being pushed out, locals being pushed out or whatever. But hey, the institution should just do what's best for the institution. Is that fair to say that, or fair to extend this logic to?
Sure, yeah. So it's the YIMBY idea.
Yeah. And okay, so now let's take it to a different. Okay, let's give this. I'll give a far-fetched example, but just for a thought experiment. Let's say Kenya, I'm just picking a random country in Africa, is like 80% Kenyan or whatever, like, and it's a black.
Kenya is extremely ethnically divided. Like, you have all the various tribes of Kenya who support small political parties that act. They have like ethnic political parties. There's no Kenyan race.
Okay, well, imagine a country in Africa that was 90% one race. And
Botswana.
okay, okay,
Botswana means land of the Tswana, and it in fact is like it's an ethnically homogeneous realm of the Tswana people.
basically, okay, imagine a far-fetched scenario where, you know, millions of white Americans were flooding into, the country, and
Of Botswana.
yeah, and
Well, it is a nice place.
right, and there was a risk of actually the Botswanan natives becoming a minority in their own country, basically. And so the question is, do countries like
Great replacement for Botswana.
right, yeah, exactly, like, do countries have a right to have like ethnic quotas of their sort of native population, or should they, whether it's Brazil or France, or I don't know, I'm just naming random countries, like, do they have, could Brazil be like, hey, we have the right to be Brazil, we have like, we're not just an idea, we're also a people.
Do countries have the right? I mean, of course, countries have the right. Countries are sovereign. They can do whatever the fuck they want as long as someone doesn't have an army to stop them from doing it. There's no authority until we establish a world government. We can't say countries have rights. Like, would I bomb Botswana to stop them from doing that? No. I don't think we should bomb Botswana or even sanction them. Like, I wouldn't sanction Botswana for doing that, right? I might say, hey, Botswana, I think that's a bad idea. Or I might say, you know what, you do you, whatever. But like, fundamentally, that's Botswana's choice. And yeah, so whether countries, officially, almost no country defines itself ethnically. De facto, a lot of countries still do. A lot of countries still think of themselves as you know as a racially homogeneous place, and we need to keep that. With our immigration policy, we need to keep ourselves racially homogeneous. Most of those countries are poor, and so we don't think about it much. It's poor countries that usually do this and sort of don't face a lot of international opprobrium because, like, no one gives a shit whether. I mean, Botswana is actually not that poor. They're sort of middle income. They control the entire global diamond trade. People, yeah. If you want to know which ethnicity controls the global diamond trade, it's the Tswana. You ain't never even heard of them. Anyway, they're very good at this, and they sort of did a kind of a hostile takeover of De Beers. A diamond is forever. Like, that's the Tswana. You're given money to fund the, and I support this. Botswana is a nice place. I want to go visit there. But basically, a lot of poor countries do sort of act like this. Not a lot in like Latin America. You don't see this. You do see this a little bit in Africa, although there aren't many countries that do act like this. So a lot of the poor countries haven't had to face significant immigration except from wars next door. People escaping a war next door. So like, in Vietnam will be there, and like some Cambodian people will come into Vietnam because there was a massive war in Cambodia and they'll flood there, right? Vietnam didn't want this, so they overthrew the Khmer Rouge so that they wouldn't have ethnic Cambodians immigrating to Vietnam. And so good job, guys. And then China got mad at that and invaded Vietnam, and then Vietnam kicked their butt, and that's the history of the 70s. But anyway, I guess the point is that you do see poor countries do this, but there's not a lot of countries that are super racially homogeneous in this world, right? Like, most poor countries are not that way. In fact, most rich countries are not really that way, but certainly the countries that are that way are heavily weighted toward Europe and East Asia. And you can say, well, that's why those countries are rich. They got rich because they were homogeneous, blah, blah, blah. Maybe, maybe not. But it could have been just something correlated with that. Like, they got rich because they had very strong national institutions, because they fought over borders, because they defined themselves as ethno-states, so they fought over these borders, blah, blah, blah. And so they had to develop these strong bureaucracies and armies and I don't know. All right. These are big open questions. But you just don't see this a lot. Like, you do see it de facto in places, right? Whether or not countries have a right to do it, I don't know. But ethno-states are sort of falling out of favor. Doing that has fallen out of favor. And because I think it can, like, when you talk about immigration limitation, that's one thing, but what you often see is genocide. Ethnic cleansing is our fancy name for expulsion, right? We used to call that expulsion. Kick the people out. Don't kill them necessarily, maybe kill a few of them to scare them, but like, mostly just kick them out. And then genocide, you just kill as many as you can find and hope the rest run away. Like, there's a blurry line between those two things, right? It's like, how many do you kill? Like, the Armenian genocide was also an attempt at expelling Armenians, right? They were just like, let's just kill them till they go away. And they did. And then some went away by dying and some went away by moving. And that was what it was. And so rarely do you see the Nazi kind of genocide where it's like, wherever you are, we're going to hunt you down across the world and kill you. That's a very Nazi, that's like, the Nazis were weird. They were especially bad, but they're not typical. Most genocides are just like, you, race, get the fuck out, and we'll kill you until you get the fuck out. So like the Parsley Massacre in Dominican Republic, where they just killed the Haitians, right? They were like, okay, we don't want Haitians in this country. We'll kill you, or you can run away. You can run away, or you can die, but either way, you're going to be out of this country. Go to Haiti, ethnic Haitians, and we're going to ask you if you can pronounce the word parsley, and if you don't, we'll just machine gun you. And that's what that was in the 30s. And so they killed, I don't know, tens of thousands of Haitians, whatever. That was pretty horrible. But the problem is the ethno-state stuff tends to lead to shit like that. You tend to get that, and we don't like that. I don't like that. Do you like that? Like, do you think? I don't like that either. And I think some people do like that. They're like, well, that's how you get homogeneous states, and periodically you have to clean up your states ethnically. There are people who think that, and I think that's bullshit.
Let me ask a question. Let me tie back to it. Do you believe in global government? Like, do you think that's a good idea? How do you think about global governments or global governance?
That's interesting because there are certain governments exist to provide public goods, and there are some public goods you can provide, such as stopping climate change or like international drug trafficking, whatever. And you could certainly use global government to, like, I don't know, stop border wars, intervene and stop civil wars. So there are some sort of public goods you could provide, but there's no national defense. There's no interplanetary defense, right? I guess there is, but just from rocks, right? And a lot of these global problems can be solved by just a few large powerful nations getting together and say, okay, guys, let's set up a big thing to zap the rocks. All right, let's get together and just decide not to use like those chemicals in our refrigerators that are destroying the ozone. And then the ozone came back. So a lot of these things, climate change is obviously a tough one to crack because the carbon is so pervasive in our economy. But I think we're actually going to do it. So global government, there are reasons for it to exist, but then the strong reason for it not to exist is that it kills experimentation.
Yeah, kills diversity of experiments, of thought, of
kills diversity of, right. Yeah. You enforce conformity all over the world, and there's no exit from there, right? You can't go to Mars until Elon colonizes Mars. I don't know. But as things stand, you can't just go to Mars. And so the idea of removing international exit as a way of improving institutions, just say, like, Norway, you tax people too much. I'm going to move now. Like, you would get rid of that. You would get rid of, what if the global government became a global fascist government? I think we've seen enough to know that no government can be assured to be democratic and rights respecting in perpetuity. Sometimes countries get taken over by bad guys, right? And as I forget who said it, Thomas Paine, but it was sometimes the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants alike, or something like I forget who exactly said that. I think maybe it was Thomas Paine. But that's true, unfortunately. And I don't want global fascist government. I would like the non-fascist governments to be able to gang up on the fascist governments and get rid of them, instead of having fascists seize this centralized node of power, communists or whoever is going to take over.
Well, to that end, do you think a multipolar world is possible, or is it better that there's not global government, but that there is like one nation that can run the world, basically, or sort of set? Like, to what extent is multipolarity a good thing or not a good thing for like global stability?
I don't know. I think it's almost not worth debating because it's not something we can decide with policy. Like, multipolar world is a reality. Even we had the unipolar moment of America, but even then, we've only had two unipolar moments in the history of the world, right? One of them only covered Eurasia, and one of them covered the whole world. And there were, like 20 years of American unipolarity, right? And about 50 years of Mongol unipolarity back in the Mongol days over Eurasia. And then, like, you had one guy who could credibly claim to be king of the world, which in Mongolian is pronounced Genghis Khan. But yeah, so you could have one guy, he's like, I'm king of the world, ma. Like, but then usually that doesn't happen. Like, usually you have multipolarity, and eventually the Mongol Empire broke up into successor states that started fighting each other, and then external people started beating them, and that broke up. And then America, China rose to challenge America, and so now we have a multipolar world again. But before, like the Cold War, we had a bipolar world, right? And then before World War II, we had a multipolar world for as far back as we know. Like the British Empire was never a global hegemon. It was the biggest, but it was never a global hegemon in the way that the Mongols were hegemon of Eurasia. Like Britain couldn't just kick everyone's ass at once if it wanted to. The Mongols could, but Britain could not. Like Britain couldn't beat Russia, France, Germany, and America. If those had ganged up on them, they would have just died. So we had a multipolar world at that point, and at no point previously, there was no one else who was a unipolar global hegemon. That never happened.
Yeah. Well, let's bring this back to the US for a second, and back to the race. Imagine a world, and I actually don't know the demographics on this, but that there was a risk that in the next 20 years, the US would become like a majority Spanish speaking country. Like the Hispanics were just procreating or immigrating at a rate that's so high that, like, do you think the US should be like, wait a minute, we don't want to be like, we love having, Latinos in this country, but, and I'm half Colombian, my mom immigrated to this country from Colombia, but we don't want to become a majority.
Speak Spanish? Are you bilingual?
I'm bilingual. I'm a total gringo. I understand Spanish fluently, but if I speak it, I will sound like a gringo. But I spent 6 months in Colombia. I studied abroad there in college. And yeah, I grew up. But what do you think about that sort of question? Like, should a country have some thinking around just maintaining some level of its,
Sure, why not? I mean, it depends on the country, but so America's never had a problem with this because everyone just learns English. After the second generation, nobody speaks Spanish, and the second generation is all bilingual, and then the third generation is just monolingual.
But you've been to Florida, there are some parts where you do feel like you're in.
There's enclaves.
Or Miami,
When I grew up in College Station, Texas, there was a little town called Snook that was just a short drive away that we'd go for kolaches because everyone was Czech, and you still heard people speak Czech in that little town. It was just a few thousand people, but maybe 2,000 people. I don't even know. It was a tiny little town, but people would speak Czech to each other. And then you still have towns in Pennsylvania, little towns in Pennsylvania where people speak German to each other on the street. It's an old form of German. And there's still towns in the Midwest, I think, where people still speak Swedish. You still have some of these weird ethnic enclaves in America, but they're tiny, right? And Spanish is not going to be a thing in New Mexico and Miami. And when immigration trickles off, it's only constant replenishment of immigrants that keeps Spanish alive. Already, Spanish use is declining in America. And so, there will come a time when companies stop doing press two for Spanish. That will end because people will be like, nobody speaks Spanish anymore. That's an old thing. That happened with German. And I mean, of course, with German, we also had World War I, which involved linguistic discrimination against Germany. And we renamed a lot of German stuff to Anglo-sounding stuff. But that's another story. You don't hear these languages anymore. The Italian is basically out, right? And so Spanish, we have this big land border with Mexico. So obviously it's, and we have Cuba close to Florida. But then, and of course, we have Puerto Rico as part of America. I don't think Puerto Rico will, I think if Puerto Rico becomes a state, they will eventually go to English. But if they don't become a state, they won't. And I think this is one of the big reasons why they haven't chosen statehood yet. Although I think a majority want it, but they also, I think a lot of people realize that would be the long-term death knell of Spanish in Puerto Rico, because people would, move there more. Americans would move there more. And then it would, English would start to be the de facto language. I think that will happen. The Hong Kong protests were really about language. And I think people don't understand that it was about the elimination of Cantonese by Mandarin. And so do nations, is it bad to preserve linguistic homogeneity? No, but it's also not very hard. Mass expelling people is almost never the way to, France, the French language was a small minority language spoken around Paris, right? That was a small minority language of the lands ruled by the king of the Franks. You ever see Monty Python and the Holy Grail, that old movie?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Do you remember how he's who are Britons? And he's you, me, we're all Britons. It's that's how things were. It's who? Britons? But through a series of international wars and homogenizing institutions, there was internal linguistic conformity was created. And so, the Catalan language still exists in parts of Spain, but doesn't really exist. No one speaks Catalan and French in France anymore. They speak French. And part of this was because of the French Revolutionary Wars. Everyone was La France, and they took the tricolor flag and then fought all the Prussians and the whoever in this big, like 30 years long war, and then more wars and wars and wars. And so France became this very nationalistic nation forged through the crucible of war, and also homogenizing institutions that said, you will all speak French now. And so it's linguistic conformity is actually not that hard. You don't have, like, demographics are not typically the most powerful instrument for getting people to speak a language.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. It's almost like, colonization used to be much more, or like strong and direct, but you could imagine almost like a slow march through institutions where, like some populations just have more kids over time. And we maybe next episode or a future episode, we should do a post, talk about your other post around sort of human shrink, like population, underpopulation, or just demographics. And, I think you've written in the past about how Africa is, going to be a much bigger, part of the sort of global population because of their sort of fertility rates. But within countries, yeah, groups can rise. Like within Israel, for example, the religious community, it has much more kids, so they are rising in influence, and the sort of like the most religious, Israelis, and so that presents challenges of is Israel going to become, much more like, strict in like, you know really Israel is an ethno state, but it's
And what's interesting in Israel is that the ultra-Orthodox don't join the army.
right, exactly.
They are not really nationalists. So people who are highly religious but skeptical of the nation state of Israel as an organization are now going to take over in Israel demographically.
Right, exactly.
Not through immigration, but through breeding.
Yeah, and so that's interesting.
And so what are you going to do then? Where does Israel go then? I think that the likeliest thing is for Israel to become more theocratic than it is now and make a deal with those people and say, we're just going to become straight up theocracy. Even more, like, they have some de facto, they have some elements of theocracy now, but I think they're going to become more theocratic as a way to get buy-in from the people, from the demographically dominant ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So you asked me where I net out on this, and I'll let you go in a minute. Basically, it's like, I think that I want most of the world, like 95% of the world's powerful, countries and states, to not be ethno-states. I want them to be nation state. Like neither ethno-states nor theocracies, because I don't want sort of, genocide, or I don't want these places to have nukes. And, that said, I do think there's a, and my bias, of course, is also that I'm half Israeli. It's almost like barbell. It's almost like the nation
I
state.
didn't know you're half Israeli or half Colombian.
Yeah, exactly. Half Israeli, half Colombian.
I'm learning all kinds of things. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like the network state approach, where it's like this Rod Dreher had this book.
Were your ancestors Jewish on both sides?
No, just the Israeli side. My Colombian side is not Jewish. Rod Dreher has this book called Benedict Option, where he's like, Christians should go create their own city or state. And I could see, like, basically lots of mini Israels popping up. Like, there was a Back to Africa move. I know there's a certain group of people, some people just want to be around their own kind, and I think I'm fine with them having, going and creating their own little state. I don't want them to have nukes. I don't want them to, like, cause major global problems. But, like, if they want to go do that, I think there's clearly a demand for that. And yeah, it's kind of like Balaji's network. So why not just go create something? I don't want the world to be run like that, but I would rather they go do that in their own place than, like, try to, convert France into like a Muslim country or something. I'm not saying that that's like an example, random example some people bring up, but, like, if that makes sense, like,
I think Britain is more likely to have people try to convert it to a Muslim country than France.
right. So if there are people, and this is where I'm, like, sympathetic to the two-state solution in theory, of, like, yeah, given their own state. I think it just so happens that they're fighting over the same land. But in theory, yeah, I want Palestinians to have their own state. Like, why not? They would be causing less problems in sort of with the Israel in theory. But yeah, that's kind of where I net out is I'm okay with it on a small level, but just don't want it to sort of dictate global politics or global, sort of.
I guess that's right, but I sort of think if other people want their states to be ethno-states, I can criticize that, but I'm not going to really do anything about it. And I think that the idea of Westphalian sovereignty is that I shouldn't, even if you're a complete nightmare state like North Korea, I shouldn't bomb you to make you change. I can, like, countries shouldn't be constantly bullying other countries to try to, like, make them switch their system of government. And so I think that this is something America got wrong during its unipolar moment. We, under George W. Bush, we thought the idea is if you're not democratic, we can just invade and make you democratic. And I think that in an idealized world where that actually worked, and B, we could rely on the person doing it, and C, the invasions didn't kill a lot of people, you could just do a decapitation strike of 5 assholes at the top of a thing and democracy, maybe that could work. But none of those things are true or even remotely close to true or ever will be. And so the idea of us being this ideological promoter of democracy through force has been very thoroughly discredited. And so if you want to be an ethno-state, I can sit here and write blog posts saying you shouldn't do that, but ultimately then at that point, I'm just Ian Miles Chong, right? I'm just some asshole from overseas who just opines and holds forth on other countries' politics that he doesn't really understand and tells you how to organize your country, and you'd be perfectly justified in not listening to me, right? So because we shouldn't listen to Ian Miles Chong about American politics, and so maybe if I tell, the UK or France how they should define their own nation, maybe they shouldn't listen to me either. And so there's in terms of am I fine with other countries being ethnostates, maybe I can hold forth and say, well, like Japan, I think you should get weebs instead of ethnic Japanese factory workers from Brazil. You should get a bunch of weebs. I can say that, but Japan is perfectly within its rights to say no, shut the fuck up. They wouldn't be so rude, but they would just sort of nod and ignore me. And that's perfectly within their rights. In fact, I expect them to do that. I can offer my perspective, but I do not think that America, the United States, should be in the business of using force to decide who is an ethno-state and who's not. And in fact, the idea, even if you think Israel is an ethno-state, the idea that we should use international force to stop it from being thus is wrong. I think, if Israel wants to define itself ethnically, which I don't think it really does. I think it's really religious, but that aside, if it wants to, I don't think we should bomb them to make them stop. But I do think that, sort of grabbing land in the West Bank is bad, and there should be some sort of way to deal with that. No one's really talking about that because you have the Palestine people who are just destroy all Israel, kill all these people, expel the Jews, whatever. And then you have which has increasingly become the dominant position on the American left, actually. Jews back to Poland or whatever the fuck has become the dominant position among the Palestine movement. But then on the other, the pro-Israel side, it's well, these Palestinians just suck, so might as well push them off or push them off their land. There's no one who's really saying, well, Israel can define itself however it wants and be an ethno-state or whatever. Just stop taking land from people, stop colonizing the West Bank. That position used to be a viable political position and has basically now disappeared. You only have land grabbers of one tribe or the other, which is why I kind of despair of finding anyone who agrees with me on that. But also, my opinion on it doesn't matter because I'm a foreigner anyway.
I didn't know Ian Miles Chong doesn't even live in the U.S.
What, that guy? He's Malaysian. I don't know if he's ever even been. I don't think he's been to the U.S.
That's pretty funny. He did.
He's a freaking Malaysian. He just decided to have a hobby of getting involved in American politics. I think he has never traveled to the United States.
That's
I don't think he's set foot in this country. He is just a random online dork who decided that American politics is now my hobby. I mean, there's some other guys like that too from various other countries, but he's the most prominent.
Well, yeah, it's fine. American politics is the best reality show. Every other country, not every other, but a lot of people all over the world care who wins president, whereas we don't really care who's only people like you and I care, but most Americans don't care who's president, or prime minister in other countries. But yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, no one even knows. Balaji was very mad about the coup in Bangladesh.
Oh, was he?
Yeah, he's really mad.
Why?
He blames this on America sponsoring the coup, which we didn't sponsor that coup, but because the leader of the Sheikh Hasina, the leader of Bangladesh, who was deposed, was very pro-India, and was deposed by people who, among them, are Islamists, who are more sort of some more pro-Pakistan, or just Muslim Brotherhood ideology types. And he's mad about that, and so he blames the U.S. because it's easy to blame the U.S. now, especially if you're Balaji and you're sitting in Singapore or whatever. But he's mad that a pro-Indian leader got deposed. I actually think, yeah, this will end up not being great for Bangladesh. I think that the liberal revolutions against authoritarian leaders in predominantly Muslim countries had this uncomfortable tendency of of being reversed very quickly when the Islamists take over the revolution. That happened in Iran. It happened in Egypt. It happens everywhere. And so things I think will not go amazing in Bangladesh unless someone manages to sort of restore order. But, yeah, like, I don't know. I wasn't a United States supported coup.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we are a bit over time, so I'll let you go for now. But as always, this was a great conversation, and until next time.
Until next time.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and erictornberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.